That's your disorderly conduct right there, because I told you not to be cussing in front of the kids.
Begins the way many low-level police encounters do. A request for removal, not arrest, a disturbance framed as inconvenience, not danger. Officers are dispatched to a residence where a woman has allegedly entered a home, refused to leave, and become emotionally unregulated. On paper, this is a textbook civil standby restore order, separate parties, and resolve the trespass without escalation. What unfolds instead is a case study in how authority drifts, hardens, and ultimately asserts itself not through law, but through control. From the moment officers arrive, the power dynamic is unstable. The woman at the center of the call is visibly agitated, verbally erratic, and emotionally overwhelmed. She is not calm, but neither is she violent. Her distress fills the room, and officers respond not by slowing the interaction, but by accelerating it. Rather than grounding the encounter in clear legal thresholds, what crime, if any, has occurred, the interaction becomes dominated by tone management. The goal quietly shifts from resolution to compliance. This is the first critical pivot. Police authority is not triggered by emotional intensity, it is triggered by law. But when officers treat agitation as defiance and volume as threat, emotional regulation becomes the unspoken standard. The woman is repeatedly told to listen, to lower her voice, to stop yelling. None of these directives are unlawful requests in themselves. Yet they are not legal commands tied to an arrestable offense. They are behavioral corrections, enforced through proximity, repetition, and eventually, coercion. At this stage, officers repeatedly offer transportation home. This offer is framed as assistance, but it is conditional. The woman must comply, must answer questions on command, must modulate her tone, and must accept the officer's narrative of events. When she resists this framing, questioning why she would go to jail, disputing the motives of others present, the offer remains on the table, but the patience behind it erodes. What began as an option slowly becomes leverage. Crucially, officers never clearly articulate the legal basis for detention. The woman is told she is trespassing, yet she is not arrested for trespass. She is told she is not going to jail, yet is repeatedly threatened with consequences if she fails to comply. This ambiguity is not accidental. It allows officers to maintain flexibility while the subject remains uncertain, anxious, and reactive. Uncertainty is power. Confusion breeds compliance or resistance that can be punished. As the interaction moves toward the doorway, physical space becomes a tool. Officers guide, then pressure, then crowd. The woman clings to personal items, bags, and container, symbols of autonomy, in a moment where control is slipping away. Each attempt to retain possession is treated not as anxiety, but as obstruction. The officer's language shifts subtly from negotiation to instruction, from instruction to warning. One officer explicitly introduces a new legal threshold: disorderly conduct. The justification is no longer trespass, nor refusal to leave, but language itself, specifically profanity in the presence of children. This is a pivotal expansion of authority. Disorderly conduct statutes are notoriously elastic, often invoked when behavior is disruptive but not dangerous. Their vagueness makes them powerful tools of escalation, particularly when applied selectively. The woman is warned that continued profanity will result in enforcement. This is framed as a clear boundary, but the boundary is unevenly enforced. Her emotional state does not change, nor does the environment meaningfully shift. Children are referenced, but the focus remains on her tone rather than any concrete harm. The warning functions less as a deterrent and more as a setup. Once issued, it creates a pretext waiting to be activated. As officers move her outside, the interaction deteriorates rapidly. The woman continues to speak loudly, continues to protest, continues to assert that she is being treated unfairly. Officers interpret this persistence not as distress, but as willful defiance. The decision to handcuff her is presented as inevitable, an outcome of her choices rather than theirs. This framing is central to understanding how authority justifies itself. The officers position themselves as reluctant enforcers, forced into action by non-compliance. Yet every escalation point, the narrowing of options, the introduction of new charges, the physical handling originates with police discretion. The woman does not escalate into violence. She escalates into desperation. When handcuffs are applied, the encounter crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. What was framed as a ticketable offense becomes a custodial arrest. The woman's physical instability falling, Struggling to stand, clothing slipping is treated as resistance rather than vulnerability. Her loss of balance is attributed to intoxication, not stress or panic. Officers respond with force calibrated not to stabilize, but to control. This is where the system reveals itself. Once physical control is initiated, every subsequent reaction by the subject is filtered through the lens of resistance. Attempts to adjust clothing, to regain footing, to protest treatment are reclassified as non-compliance. The narrative solidifies. She is difficult, uncooperative, the architect of her own predicament. The officers' language among themselves reinforces this narrative. They discuss additional charges, justify their actions, and preemptively frame the woman's behavior for future handlers. This backstage dialogue is not about safety, it is about documentation. It ensures that the official record will align with the force used, rather than the force being scrutinized against the record. Notably, the woman is repeatedly told she is not going to jail until she is. The promise of leniency evaporates the moment compliance fails. This bait-and-switch dynamic is not incidental, it is structural. It encourages cooperation through false reassurance while preserving the option of punishment. As the woman is placed into the vehicle, her distress intensifies. Officers respond not with de-escalation, but with admonishment. Her emotional breakdown is treated as inconvenience. When she struggles to position herself properly, it is framed as resistance. The possibility that she is overwhelmed, frightened, or physically compromised is dismissed. By the time she is transported, the original purpose of the call is almost irrelevant. What remains is an arrested woman charged not for the initial complaint, but for her reaction to police authority. Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest replaced trespass as the official justification. The system has completed its pivot. The problem is no longer what brought officers there, but how the woman behaved once they arrived. This is the quiet machinery of escalation. No single decision appears outrageous in isolation. Each step is small, justified, procedural. But together, they form a pipeline from assistance to arrest a pipeline, powered by discretion, emotional misinterpretation, and legal ambiguity. In this first phase of the encounter, the most striking element is not the woman's behavior, but the officer's failure to anchor their authority in clear, consistent legal reasoning. Instead, authority is exercised through tone policing, conditional offers, and escalating threats. The result is predictable. Confusion becomes resistance, resistance becomes justification, and justification becomes force. This is not an outlier. It is a pattern seen repeatedly in low-level encounters where officers are asked to manage behavior rather than enforce law. When police become arbiters of acceptable emotion, enforcement inevitably follows subjectivity, and subjectivity, when armed, carries consequences. By the end of this segment, the woman has lost autonomy, dignity, and freedom not because she posed a danger, but because she failed to perform calmness under pressure. The system did not ask whether arrest was necessary. It asked whether compliance was achieved. When it was not, authority asserted itself in the only language it had left. The next phase will show how that assertion is formalized, justified, and insulated, how the aftermath of escalation becomes evidence of its necessity rather than its failure. By the time the woman is fully restrained, the encounter has passed its point of no return. What matters now is not what actually happened, but how what happened will be explained. This is the stage where policing becomes narrative management, where actions taken in the moment must be retroactively justified through procedure, language, and charges that make force appear necessary, rather than discretionary. Once handcuffs are applied, the officer's posture changes. The language softens in places, sharpens in others. The earlier uncertainty, are you going to jail or notties, replaced with definitive control. She is told she is being detained, then cited, then informed she may be charged further, depending on how she behaves. The shifting explanation is not meant to clarify. It is meant to stabilize authority after the fact. This is a crucial psychological shift. For the officers, the primary threat is no longer the subject's behavior, but the possibility that their actions could be questioned. From this moment forward, every movement the woman makes is framed as resistance, every vocalization as non-compliance. Her distress is no longer relevant except as evidence. Her physical instability becomes a focal point. She stumbles, falls, struggles to maintain balance. Rather than recognizing this as a foreseeable consequence of emotional overload, intoxication, or the stress of being restrained in public, officers interpret it as deliberate obstruction. The phrase "stop resisting" appears not as a response to violence, but as a prophylactic language that transforms vulnerability into culpability. This reframing is powerful because it collapses cause and effect. The woman is struggling because she is restrained, but the restraint is justified because she is struggling. Once this loop is established, escalation becomes self-sustaining. Additional force no longer requires new justification, it only requires continued movement. As officers maneuver her toward the vehicle, the degradation of dignity becomes visible. Her clothing shifts, exposing her body in a public space. She vocalizes embarrassment and fear. These moments are not peripheral, they are central. Public exposure is one of the most destabilizing experiences a person can endure, particularly when combined with restraint. Yet the response is procedural, even dismissive. The focus remains on getting her into the car, not preserving her dignity. This is where the system's priorities are most clearly revealed. Officer safety and procedural efficiency are elevated above all else, including the subject's humanity. The possibility that slowing down, repositioning, or pausing could reduce distress is not meaningfully considered. Time becomes the enemy. Control must be reasserted quickly, decisively, and visibly. Inside the patrol car, the dynamic shifts again. The woman is now isolated, physically constrained, and entirely dependent on the officers. Her emotional breakdown intensifies. She cries, yells, pleads. None of this alters the course of events. At this stage, emotional expression no longer influences outcomes. The narrative is already set. What follows is telling. Officers discuss additional charges. The decision to add resisting arrest is not framed as a response to violence or flight, but to the way she was. This phrase is vague by design. It does not describe a specific act, it describes a disposition. Resistance in this context is not defined by behavior, but by attitude. This is a critical institutional failure. Resisting arrest statutes are intended to address physical interference with lawful arrest. When they are applied to emotional distress or physical instability, they become tools for punishing non-compliance rather than ensuring safety. The result is charge stacking, a practice that amplifies consequences without clarifying wrongdoing. The officer's internal conversation reveals another layer of concern: how the woman will be perceived by others in the system. They preemptively label her uncooperative. This label will follow her from booking to court-shaping how her behavior is interpreted at every stage. Once affixed, it is rarely questioned. This is how the system insulates itself. By controlling the initial narrative, officers ensure that subsequent decision-makers, jail staff, prosecutors, judges encounter the woman not as a person in crisis, but as a problem already defined. Her actions are filtered through reports written by those who restrained her. Her voice is secondary, if it appears at all. Notably absent throughout this phase is any meaningful effort at de-escalation. No medical evaluation is prioritized. No mental health intervention is requested. The woman's repeated statements about distress are treated as noise rather than information. The possibility that she is experiencing a mental health crisis is never operationalized into care. Instead, intoxication becomes the explanatory shorthand. Alcohol is invoked not to justify assistance, but to justify control. It explains her behavior without requiring empathy. It absolves officers of responsibility for her emotional state while reinforcing the necessity of restraint. As the transport continues, the woman's fear escalates into panic. Her movements inside the vehicle are again described as resistance. Officers respond with warnings rather than reassurance. The tone is corrective, not supportive. This is not about calming her, it is about preventing further complications. The moment she is removed from the vehicle at the next location, the cycle repeats. She is instructed, she hesitates, she struggles. Each hesitation is met with pressure. Each struggle is met with warnings. The language of escalation is already in place, waiting to be activated. What is striking is how little the original incident matters now. The trespass complaint, the refusal to leave, the interpersonal conflict that prompted the call, these are background details, largely irrelevant to the outcome. The woman is no longer being processed for what she did before police arrived, but for how she responded to police presence. This inversion is central to understanding modern low-level enforcement. Police often enter situations as neutral arbiters, but leave as the primary source of conflict. When individuals fail to adapt quickly enough to the expectations of authority, enforcement shifts from addressing a complaint to correcting behavior. The charges reflect this shift. Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest are not about harm caused to others. They are about disruption of order and challenge to authority. They criminalize nonconformity under stress. They transform emotional dysregulation into legal liability. From an institutional perspective, this outcome is efficient. The woman is removed from the scene. The officer's authority is affirmed. The incident is closed. But efficiency is not the same as justice, and control is not the same as safety. The most troubling aspect of this phase is how normalized it appears. There is no sense of urgency, no recognition that something has gone wrong. The officers do not reflect on alternative approaches. They do not question whether arrest was necessary. They move forward as though this outcome was inevitable. This normalization is what allows patterns of misconduct to persist. When escalation is framed as the natural consequence of non-compliance, responsibility is displaced entirely onto the subject. The system never has to ask whether its own actions contributed to the outcome. By the end of this phase, the woman has been fully absorbed into the criminal justice process. Her emotional collapse has been reframed as criminal behavior. Her resistance to being controlled has been codified as a charge. Her distress has been documented as justification. What began as a request to remove someone from a home has become a custodial arrest with multiple charges. Not because the situation demanded it, but because the system defaulted to control over care, enforcement over understanding, and authority over restraint. In the final phase, the consequences of this escalation become clear not just for the woman involved, but for the broader system that allowed a manageable situation to spiral into criminalization. The aftermath will reveal how these encounters echo beyond the moment, shaping lives, records, and trust long after the bodycam is turned off. The final stage of this encounter is quieter, but more consequential. The physical struggle has ended. The shouting fades into background noise. What remains is paperwork, processing, and permanence. This is where a temporary crisis becomes a lasting record, and where the consequences of escalation extend far beyond the sidewalk where it began. By the time the woman reaches booking, her identity has been effectively rewritten. She is no longer a distressed individual removed from a private residence. She is now an arrestee labeled disorderly, resistant, uncooperative. These descriptors are not neutral. They shape how she will be treated, how her credibility will be assessed, and how much latitude she will be given going forward. This transformation happens without ceremony. There is no formal declaration that her status has changed. It simply solidifies through repetition. Officers repeat the charges. They repeat the reasons. They repeat the narrative to one another and to intake personnel. Each repetition hardens the story, making it less likely that anyone will interrogate its foundation. The woman, meanwhile, is still in distress. Her emotional state does not reset simply because the encounter has moved indoors. If anything, it worsens. The environment is unfamiliar, restrictive, and overwhelming. She is surrounded by strangers who now have authority over her movements, her belongings, and her body. Any remaining sense of control is gone. In this context, her continued agitation is predictable. But predictability does not equal culpability. The system, however, treats it as such. Emotional expression is still interpreted through the lens of resistance. Anxiety becomes non-compliance. Confusion becomes obstruction. The same framework that justified force on the street now governs her treatment inside. What is absent at every stage is meaningful intervention. There is no pivot to mental health evaluation. No acknowledgement that the situation may have exceeded the scope of traditional law enforcement. The possibility that arrest has exacerbated the problem rather than solved it is never raised. The system proceeds as designed, even when design and reality are misaligned. The charges themselves are revealing. Disorderly conduct and resisting arrest are often described as convenience charges, broad statutes that allow officers to formalize control after the fact. They rarely require a harmed victim. They rarely hinge on objective evidence. Instead, they rely on officer perception, discretion, and testimony. This reliance creates a power imbalance that is difficult to challenge. In court, The woman's behavior will be filtered through reports written by the very people who restrained her. Her emotional breakdown will be described as belligerence, her instability as intoxication, her fear as aggression. The original context being forcibly removed, publicly exposed, physically restrained will be backgrounded, if mentioned at all. Even if the charges are minor, the consequences are not. An arrest record carries weight. It affects employment, housing, and future interactions with law enforcement. It alters how the individual is perceived by institutions that rely on background checks and risk assessments. A moment of crisis becomes a data point that follows her indefinitely. This is the hidden cost of escalation. The system measures success by immediate outcome seen cleared, subject detained, report filed. It does not measure the long-term impact on the person arrested, nor does it account for the erosion of trust that results from such encounters. From a policing perspective, the incident may be logged as routine. No injuries reported. No use of force flags raised. The officers followed procedure as they understood it. Yet procedure is not synonymous with justice. When procedures are applied without context, they can produce outcomes that are technically correct and morally hollow. The most troubling aspect of this case is how preventable it was. At multiple points, the trajectory could have shifted. Clearer communication about legal status, slower pacing, physical distance instead of crowding, a decision to disengage rather than enforce tone. None of these options required extraordinary resources. They required restraint. Instead, the system defaulted to escalation because escalation is familiar. Officers are trained extensively in control tactics and enforcement authority, but far less in managing emotional crisis without criminalization. When confronted with unpredictability, the response is to narrow options, not expand them. This case also exposes the fragility of the concept of reasonable behavior in police encounters. The expectation that individuals remain calm, articulate, and compliant under stress is unrealistic. When failure to meet that expectation becomes grounds for arrest, policing shifts from enforcing law to enforcing demeanor. This shift disproportionately impacts those already vulnerable people experiencing mental health crises, substance use issues, or acute stress. Their inability to perform calmness is treated as defiance rather than need. The system responds not with care, but with cuffs. In the aftermath, there is no reckoning. The officers do not revisit their decisions. The institution does not flag the encounter for review. The woman's experience becomes a closed file, resolved through citation and bond. The deeper questions why escalation occurred, whether arrest was necessary, how harm could have been minimized remain unasked. This silence is itself a form of accountability failure. Without reflection, patterns repeat. Similar calls produce similar outcomes. The same statutes are invoked. The same narratives are written. Over time, these individual cases accumulate into systemic distrust. For the woman involved, the resolution is unsatisfying. Even if she is released quickly, even if the charges are later reduced or dismissed, the experience leaves a mark. Public humiliation, physical restraint, and the loss of autonomy are not easily forgotten. They shape how she will view law enforcement and how she will respond in future encounters. This is the paradox of authority. The more force is used to compel compliance, the less legitimacy that authority holds in the eyes of those subjected to it. Short-term control undermines long-term trust. Each escalation teaches the public not that the law is fair, but that it is unpredictable. In this case, the system succeeded in asserting control. The woman was removed, restrained, charged, and processed. But success measured this way ignores the broader cost. It ignores the fact that the original problem, a dispute in a home, was replaced by a larger one, the criminalization of distress. The bodycam footage captures more than an arrest. It captures a philosophy of policing that prioritizes order over understanding, authority over empathy, and efficiency over care. It shows how quickly assistance can become enforcement, and how easily discretion can harden into punishment. There is no singular villain here, no dramatic act of malice. The harm emerges from accumulation from small decisions made under pressure, guided by training that values control, and reinforced by a system that rewards compliance over compassion. This is why such cases matter. Not because they are extreme, but because they are ordinary. They reveal how everyday encounters can spiral, how legal tools meant to preserve order can be used to suppress vulnerability and how institutions can fail without breaking any explicit rules. By the time the bodycam stops recording, the outcome is set. Charges filed. Bond assigned. The woman's story moves into the court system, where it will be reduced to statutes and summaries. The nuances captured on video, the fear, the confusion, the imbalance of power will be compressed into a narrative that fits the paperwork. What remains is a question the system rarely asks. Was this the best possible outcome? Not the most efficient, not the most defensible, but the most just. In this case, the answer lingers uncomfortably. Because what unfolded was not inevitable. It was the product of choices made incrementally, reinforced institutionally, and justified procedurally. And until those choices are examined, the pattern will continue, one call at a time.